The place we know as Ruthin has been inhabited for a surprisingly long time. Archaeological evidence of human settlement in the Vale of Clwyd and on the Clwydian Hills, which overlooks the Vale, dates back to possibly 10,000 years ago or so ago, or even more, because remains of a small group of Neanderthal men, close relatives of modern humans, have been discovered in Pont Newydd caves in Cefnmeriadog. And it's not entirely fanciful that such small bands of hunter-gatherers, when they became farmers, found themselves down in the Vale in rocky outcrops such as Denby and Ruthin, in what was essentially then a marshy and heavily wooded Vale of Clwyd. The Clwydian hill forts, occupied at various times by Stone Age and Bronze Age tribes, are currently being excavated. But it's not too daring assumption to make that the people who built those forts also spent some time down in the Vale in places like Ruthin. Apart from Bronze Age spoons found near Ruthin in the late 19th century, a number of Stone Age weapon heads have been found in Ruthin, particularly in the 1980s, when archaeological excavations in the Brynhyfryd Park area, the area between Brynhyfryd School and Ruthin Hospital, took place. These excavations found definitive proof of Roman occupation of Ruthin, including cremation urns and human remains. These remains were presumably that of a Roman soldier, and they have been reinterred at Ruthin Town Cemetery. More recent excavations have suggested the use of Ruthin by the Romans as a vicus, a residential and commercial settlement outside a fort. The fort being situated possibly under what later became the site of the medieval castle that we know today as Ruthin Castle. After existing for over 3 centuries, Roman Ruthin was abandoned as part of the wider withdrawal from Britain. This withdrawal was probably a gradual process, and little for definite is known about the 500 years of chaos which followed the Roman departure. A Welsh settlement speaking a Brythonic language akin to modern Welsh grew during this period, and Ruthin, with its plentiful supply of artesian springs and standing at the crossroads of what may well have been a network of Roman roads, would have been a natural site for urban development. By the beginning of the 13th century, it had assumed a name close to today's name, formed probably from Rhydd, the red, from the locally prevalent sandstone, and Heen for edge, and not Deen as fortress, as was believed for many, many years. In battles between various Welsh princes and English kings in the 13th century, control of Dyffryn Clwyd fluctuated, and it was not until 1277 that Edward I cemented his control over the area with the construction of a ring of strong castles all over North Wales. Work began on constructing the stone-built Ruthin Castle in 1277, probably, as I've stated earlier, on the site of an earlier Welsh wooden castle, and probably even on a Roman fort. The Statute of Rhuddlan in 1284 provided the constitutional basis for English control over North Wales, and Dyffryn Clwyd was given to Reginald de Grey, a loyal supporter of the king. His family were to own the castle until the early 16th century, when it was sold back to the crown. Although the castle was in English hands from the 13th century onwards, a borough was created where English and Welsh lived side by side, surrounding the already important market in the centre of the town. This new borough left behind court records which professional historians have been able to utilise to draw up a picture of a thriving medieval community in which a number of families survived and flourished until Tudor times. In summary, by the mid-14th century, Ruthin had a complete castle, a large collegiate church, a marketplace and a mill. It had a sound administration and a thriving market. By this time, the population of the town had reached 600, and the Welsh community lived alongside an English community, probably, and I quote, not without tension, but with no excessive tension. An indication of the importance of Ruthin as a market town and of its links to the cloth industry. As an indication of that, you might be interested to learn that during the outbreak of the bubonic plague in the 14th century, universally known as the Black Death, at least 150 people died in Ruthin, possibly as many as a quarter of the local population. This is probably accounted for by the arrival of cloth from the Middle East, in which the plague fleas are believed to have been carried. Medieval Ruthin, like many Welsh towns, was little more than a huddle of houses aligned along 4 streets and dominated by a local church. One debate which continues to puzzle historians is whether Ruthin ever had clearly definable town walls or defences. References to various gates into the town would seem to suggest that the town had some walled defences, but no concrete evidence has been found. The major event in 15th century Ruthin was the rebellion of Owain Glyndŵr in 1400. The immediate trigger for this rebellion may well have been a property dispute between Glyndŵr and Reginald de Grey, but many historians have seen it as premeditated and based on long festering grievances and an attachment to an ideology of an independent Wales. The damage inflicted upon the town may well have been overstated for centuries, and Ruthin certainly was not burned to the ground, as some have stated. The new Tudor dynasty, established after Henry VII's victory at Bosworth in 1485, created the conditions for something of a renaissance for Ruthin. There were new organs for local administration and justice, and the Welsh inhabitants of the Lordship of Ruthin were enfranchised. A Welsh gentry and trader group took advantage and propelled themselves into positions of influence and wealth. Families such as the Thelwalls, the Goodmans and the Exmews became prominent even in London. The religious life of the town was transformed by the Protestant Reformation, which swept away the medieval collegiate church and allowed Gabriel Goodman to recast it as a Renaissance organisation within the Protestant Church. It's probably true to say that no private citizen before or after Gabriel Goodman has wrought such major changes in Ruthin. He refounded Ruthin School in 1574 and later became Dean of Westminster. Stuart Ruthin in the 17th century became engulfed in the English Civil War. The castle was a royalist stronghold, and King Charles I himself marched through the town in 1646. Shortly afterwards, the castle underwent a 6-week siege, kept supplied, so local legend would have it, by a secret tunnel from the Red Lion pub on Clwyd Street. The castle was subsequently destroyed, as were all previous royalist strongholds, on Cromwell's orders. After the restoration of the monarchy in 1660, Ruthin recovered and was described in 1695 as the greatest market and most popular town in the Vale. Many wealthy families built townhouses, among them Exmew House, the recently closed Barclays Bank. And this is what happened to such a fine townhouse when Barclays purchased the property in 1926. A borough corporation emerged with 2 aldermen and a council of 16 men. They met, for the most part, in the market hall in the centre of the marketplace, a building erected in the 1660s, which remained there for 200 years. Very much a trading and market centre, the town's economy was dominated by the textile and leather industries. The 18th century saw a major rebuilding of the town, with stone and brick-built buildings replacing most of the half-timbered houses which had previously proliferated in the town. Houses such as Nant Clwyd House, this fine building in which we find ourselves today. Cottages such as Rose Cottage are among the last few to have survived from the pre-Georgian period. And one disgraceful example of official vandalism occurred in the 1960s when the Ship Inn, a half-timbered pub from Tudor times, was simply demolished to make way for a road improvement scheme at the bottom of Rose Street. Major public work towards the end of the 18th century provided a new jail and a new courthouse, while new turnpike roads made travel easier and widened horizons. As befits an important market town, alehouses proliferated during this period. Our research has identified as many as 50 at various times in the 18th and 19th century. Of course, alehouses were not simply places of drinking and socialising. They were places where business was done and deals were made. One of the few to retain its original name and still operate today is the Boar's Head on Clwyd Street. Ruthin underwent considerable change during the 19th century while still remaining a small market town. A striking feature was the decline in the power of the Lordship of Ruthin, centred on the castle, and the emergence of an alternative political and social leadership, very much associated with the rise of nonconformity, which created an increasingly educated, articulate and self-confident Welsh middle class. National and local reforms led to the transformation of what had for centuries been a basically medieval town into a modern municipality, with gas street lighting, piped water and a modern sewage system, better roads, improved educational and health provision and the first telephones. In the 1860s, the town was connected with the national rail network, which had long-term economic and social consequences, not least the creation of a new street, Market Street, to link this new station with the centre of the town, and where the new town hall was built in the 1860s to replace the previous market hall on the square. Ruthin became the seat of the new Assize Court in the late 1830s and of the new Denbighshire County Council after 1889. Its selection as the county town of Denbighshire has rankled long since with the inhabitants of Denby, and was due in no small part to the pressure put on by William Cornwallis West of Ruthin Castle. The Wests had acquired the castle through marriage and built a grand neo-Gothic mansion on the ruins of the old 13th century castle. During this period, the town retained its status as a market town, serving the needs of its farming hinterland, but a new industry emerged in the shape of two aerated water companies, the Ruthin Soda Water Company, later known as the Cambrian, and the slightly larger Ellis's Works on Murdoch Street. A workhouse was built to house the paupers, but that too was razed to the ground in the 1960s. Another interesting late 19th century development was the siting of two secondary schools on the eastern periphery of the town. Ruthin School moved from its centuries-old premises behind St Peter's Church to a site on the Mould Road, and shortly afterwards, in a mansion in the field opposite, the Ruthin County School for Girls was formed, one of the earliest state-sponsored girls' secondary schools in Wales. Organised leisure activities became popular by the end of the 19th century, with the sport of football being particularly successful. The Ruthin Club fielded no fewer than 8 full Welsh internationals in the 1880s and 90s, and also reached the Welsh Cup final. During the 20th century, the population of the town almost doubled and spilled out of its medieval boundaries in large new housing estates built around the edges of the town. No fewer than 6 council house estates were built during the century, a response to social housing needs, while in the second half of the century, even larger private housing estates were erected, partly to accommodate an ever-growing number of retired people drawn to the town, and also an indication of the town's popularity as a commuter town, with people travelling to Deeside, Cheshire and Merseyside to work. One consequence of all this new house building was the halving in the number of Welsh speakers. Even so, the town retains to this day a strong and successful Welsh cultural identity. This identity was aided in no small part by the establishment of a Welsh medium primary school, Ysgol Penbarras, in 1984 to supplement the much older Victorian primaries at Rose Street and Ruthin. 1938 saw the transformation of the Girls' County School into the co-educational Bryn Hyfryd Grammar School, which became a bilateral school in the 1950s, where grammar and secondary modern pupils were educated in the same establishment. Economic changes were seen in the local economy. The two mineral water companies referred to earlier closed, but attempts were made towards the end of the century to develop a burgeoning industrial estate on the northern outskirts of the town. The livestock market remained successful as its dual premises on Market Street and Winstay Road, but problems of access prompted a move to Denby Road in 1992. The County Council too provided a regular source of employment for many, even though the county of Denbighshire disappeared for some 20 years between the 1970s and the 1990s. The town lost its status as a judicial centre when the Assize Court moved to Mould in the 1970s, and the fine 18th century courthouse subsequently became the home of the town's library. I should perhaps here mention one of the most famous trials to take place in the courthouse, when in 1960 in the mummy in the cupboard case garnered national attention. The 18th century Ruthin jail housed fewer and fewer inmates by the 20th century, and the only recorded execution at the jail took place in 1903. 10 years later, a daring escape from the jail brought one John Jones, Coch Bach considerable notoriety and even hero status in Ruthin, for it was his third such escape from the jail. His shooting in Pwllhas a few days later aroused much anger in the town, and even 50 years later a memorial headstone was raised to him following a public appeal. The two world wars hit Ruthin hard, but the town came up trumps with nearly £600,000 being raised by the townspeople for the war effort in World War II. In the First World War, the practice of recruiting PALS battalions meant that individual streets suffered heavy losses, and Murdoch Street in Ruthin was especially hard hit. The end of the war was greeted with great jubilation in the town. The next picture showing the peace celebrations on the square in 1919. Peacetime, however, proved troublesome for a number of ex-servicemen, and among them was Dick Dunn, who became a well-known tramp in the area. World War II saw the creation of Poole Park Prisoner of War Camp, a few miles west of the town. Many of the Germans and Italians housed there stayed on after 1945, and their descendants still live in the town. The jail, which had closed in 1916, became a munitions factory during this war. The closure of the railway, almost exactly a century after it was born, paved the way some years later for the building of the renowned Ruthin Craft Centre on the site of the old station. The growth in the number of private cars and public road transport, which followed the closure of the railway in 1963, contributed still further to Ruthin's role as a commuter town. A perennial problem for the town in the Ruthin and Murdoch Street area was flooding. The cause was primarily the inability of Ffrwd Arfon, the culvert which to this day runs under Murdoch Street, the widest street in the town, to cope with the sheer volume of water. Many will remember the dreadful floods of 2000, but such floods were nothing new, as this photo from 1931 will show. I have left until last the story of the end of the West Dynasty at Ruthin Castle. King Edward VII, when he was Prince of Wales towards the end of the 19th century, had spent a great deal of time at Ruthin Castle, and may well have been rather more than friends with Mrs. Cornwallis West, the almost infamous Patsy. When William Cornwallis West, whose photo we saw earlier, died in 1917, the estate passed to his rather wayward son George, and scandal continued to haunt the corridors of the castle. He had married Jenny Churchill, Winston Churchill's mother, a lady much older than himself, back in 1900. They divorced in 1914, and the spendthrift George married Mrs. Patrick Campbell, the renowned actress, barely an hour after the divorce decree was issued. Nor was Patsy immune from this scandal. Her liaison with a young army officer during World War I caused ripples in military and political circles and brought great embarrassment to the family. The result of George's extravagant lifestyle was the need to sell the bulk of the Ruthin Castle estate to pay off his debts. 2 castle sales in 1913 and 1919 saw the breaking up of the large estate, and although many properties were bought by Godfrey Licumber, a pivotal figure in 20th century Ruthin's history, the opportunity given to local people to buy their own properties marked in many ways the birth of modern Ruthin. In 1921, the castle itself was sold to a Scottish clinic and became a noted hospital until the 1960s, when the clinic closed and the castle became a hotel, still providing employment for local people as it has done for centuries. I appreciate that a talk of 40 minutes or so can only scratch the surface of the history of a town with such a wealth of history. I urge you, if you're interested in the history of this town, to visit the town and see for yourself the magnificent history that Ruthin possesses. Diolch yn fawr.